Namaste. Welcome to Inspiring Women. Our guest for today's episode of Inspiring Women is Dr. SAUDAMINI SIEGRIST. Dr. SIEGRIST worked for more than 20 years in the child protection section at UNICEF and is currently working as a consultant for the United Nations. Welcome to the show, Dr. SIEGRIST.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
What inspired you to work for the UN?
I would say the preamble to the Charter of the United Nations. It speaks about how the United Nations was created so that we could live together in peace and to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war. And that has been a tremendous inspiration for me. When I joined the United Nations working for UNICEF in 1995, it happened that my first assignment was supporting the team that set the agenda for the protection of children affected by armed conflict and supporting the Grasa Michel study on the impact of armed conflict on children. So that was of great interest to me. And over the 20 years, we achieved a lot, perhaps more than we would have imagined. And yet, today, the estimates are that more than 250 million children live in countries or areas affected by armed conflict, 30 million displaced. So despite what has been achieved, the lion's share remains to be done.
Can you tell us about a time when you felt that something you did brought about a positive outcome?
What occurred in 2003, I was working at the time at UNICEF in the emergency operations. And I was seconded to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Sierra Leone, where I served as the rapporteur for children in the preparation of a children's version of the official Truth and Reconciliation report. And that kind of work had not been done before. Children had not been involved or engaged in a truth commission, in part because it was seen as a very political activity. And the idea had been to protect children from that dynamic. However, the Sierra Leone war was a very brutal conflict and children were directly targeted. Children were among those most affected. And so it was felt that children should have a voice and they should have a role in the efforts towards reconciliation and the transitional justice from conflict to a more peaceful situation, a more peaceful society. So the protocols to protect children in those activities had not been established. And I was part of the team that worked to establish those protocols as precedent for later work that was done in other countries. And the report itself, the children's report, which was a very it was a big leap that we took, working directly with the kids, with the Children's Forum Network, the Children's Parliament, in order to determine what their priorities were, what they wanted to say. And interestingly, their number one priority coming out of that war was education. They wanted to have their own potential realized for the future of their own lives and their communities. So that was there was a lot of very important work that I was able to be a part of in that time.
So it was more of a participatory approach.
Yes, exactly. In fact, we had we established a kind of new approach, because previously it was thought that participation of children and protection of children could come to tension. Mm-hmm. We called it the thin red line. Mm-hmm. But what we established in our efforts towards the protection protocols and procedures for children was a mutually supportive approach, mm-hmm. so that protection would enable participation. Participation would inform protection. And together they would help prevent recycles or the occurrence and cycles of violence. And so that whole entire effort is to prevent the recurrence of violence and war. I'll give one example that I still remember very well. There was a 9-year-old girl who was part of the team. We had a team, there was a larger team. There was a team of about 30 children that I worked with directly, and one of them was a 9-year-old girl. Her name was Aminata. She went on to become an advocate for child rights. But at the time, we were talking about the cause of the conflict, which in international circles at the time, there was discussion about the economy of war and, the root causes and the drivers of conflict. And I remember when I asked the team of kids what they thought was the cause of the conflict in their country, she didn't hesitate. She said it was government corruption. And I was surprised that she had such a very keen perception about what had actually led to the conflict and what needed to be done to address the impacts of the conflict towards recovery and reconciliation.
What difference do you see in the outcome after the adoption of the participatory approach?
It leads to a different destination. There's no question that engaging with children or any affected population requires more resources and more time. By more resources, I mean human resources and financial resources. And it takes time to engage children or to engage an affected community. But then the destination will be more meaningful, more sustainable. It will have more ownership. So that's the benefit. For children, that's specifically in relation to Article 12 of the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which says that children have a right to have their views taken into consideration in decisions that affect them. And that, very importantly, the participation of children should be what we call genuine to the extent possible. So it shouldn't be lip service, it shouldn't be tokenistic or certainly not exploitative, but it should be a genuine, engaged, informed role for children, which is not to shift the burden of responsibility onto the shoulders of children, particularly in a situation where we're dealing with the aftermath of an armed conflict, where children didn't start the war and they shouldn't be given the role to stop it. That's not the point. But rather that they should have a role in the reconciliation and recovery. And that speaks directly to the role of the international community. The role of the international community is not to impose an agenda. It's to actually help facilitate and achieve the agenda of the affected community. Children's recovery cannot take place without the engagement and the recovery of the families and communities in which children live. And so it's a holistic approach. It's a child rights approach. And it means that the root causes are addressed and that the community is engaged, involved, and is participating.
You've mentioned that children are the ones who are the most affected during the armed conflict because they are vulnerable. You've also worked on the agenda for the protection of children during armed conflict. Could you tell us what specifically that involves?
In war, the norms of human behavior are shredded, and children are caught in the crossfire. Even more brutally, children are specifically targeted because of their vulnerability. So in identifying those violations against children, I was part of a team that created the agenda for the violations of humanitarian law that occur during armed conflict. Those include the killing and maiming of children, the recruitment or use of children for armed conflict, sexual violence against children, abduction of children, attacks against schools and hospitals, and the denial of humanitarian access for children. So that led and this is in the follow-up to the Graça-Michel study, the Agenda for Action, that led to the development of a monitoring and reporting mechanism for those violations, which then was developed into action plans, specifically for the prevention of violations and for the recovery and response. So again, it has that has achieved a lot for children, and yet we see that the violations continue. So there's still, as I said, quite a lot more work to be done.
One of the grave child rights violations that occurs before and during the wartime is recruitment of children as soldiers. And as you've talked about, it's not the duty of children to fix what the adults have destroyed. What change do you see in this area of grave child rights violation over the years?
In some ways, that issue has energized and informed the agenda for the protection of children in armed conflict, even from the very beginning. Immediately after the Graça-Michel report, there was a coalition to stop the use of child soldiers, and that was very powerful. And quite a lot was achieved as a result of that coalition over the years. In 2014, there was a campaign launched called the Campaign to Stop the Use of Child Soldiers, Children Not Soldiers. And that was co-launched by the Special Representative of the Secretary General on Children in Armed Conflict and UNICEF. And I remember at the time that took place, there were 7 countries who had been identified, or we said listed for the violation of the recruitment or use of children in armed conflict. And what was very surprising, I think it took us all by surprise at that moment, was that when the launch took place, every one of those countries, of the 7 countries that had been listed for that violation, took the microphone. And they all committed to stop and prevent recruitment of children. They didn't want children in their armies. So that was a shift, a sea change. I mean, it was a new ground. And I think that was very significant. But that's not to say that children aren't continuing to be recruited and used, in particular by armed groups, and also, though, by armed forces. So there's still, again, much work to be done. Part of the prevention and recovery from that violation are action plans, which I mentioned, which actually set out steps to help prevent violations. For example, in the case of recruitment, it's very important to have birth registration, to know the age of children. You have to have economic support. Otherwise, families are driven in desperation to, even some cases, to have their children recruited. So there has been a lot achieved. One of the other recent impacts is the agenda involving children in what we call extreme violence, where children are, in some cases, convinced to take part in acts of violence in armed conflict. So that is another very big challenge that we face. But the role of children and the engagement of children in that work has also been very important, as you asked. There's recently a new group of kids, of youth, called Global Advocates for Child Soldiers, and it's organized by young people for young people. One of their slogans is "Nothing about us without us." And the point is that they know maybe better than anyone what they need, both for prevention and recovery. Education is critical. Vocational opportunities are critical. Long-term support is necessary in the aftermath of recruitment, because the recovery is not, we used to have a 3-month, a 6-month, a 3-year window, but it's really a life journey to recover from that and to become part of the social change that brings peace and reconciliation into the communities and countries where children have been recruited.
What is a project that you're currently working on?
Since I've shifted into consultancy, I spent about 1.5 years working with the child protection team in Sri Lanka on child protection issues related to the end of the conflict. specifically involved in the issue of missing children that went missing during the war, and the tracing and family reunification of that in the aftermath of that conflict, and also reconciliation. So the reconciliation work culminated in a capacity building project where we worked with a lot of local organizations so that they could set their agenda for reconciliation and build their capacity to work across ethnic, religious, and other communities, and to come together. It's work they were already doing, but we helped in order to strengthen that, to invigorate, to inform. So that was a very interesting work for me to be involved in, and currently, actually, I'm here in Kathmandu at the moment in support of another assignment for the regional office of South Asia in strengthening the partnerships with religious leaders and faith-based organizations on child protection and across actually all the issues of UNICEF in working with not only the communities but specifically with the religious leaders in those communities in an agenda that will be co-created, not again to impose an agenda, but to actually work with communities on the priorities that they set, and to strengthen those partnerships so that they're not project-based or ad hoc, we would say, but rather that they're sustainable, owned by the communities. Some of the issues that are being addressed are ending child marriage, ending child labor, water and sanitation issues, health issues, nutrition, child protection, ending violence against children. So it runs the gamut of the programmatic issues that might be of particular priority for a community and for communities that are deeply informed by their spiritual perspective and their faith and their faith-based organizations and leaders. So that's been a real, again, a great opportunity. I'm happy to have been able to be a small part of that work.
What advice would you like to give to the youths who wish to pursue a career in the United Nations?
I've been very inspired by the work that you guys are doing. The Leadership Academy here in Nepal, where, I've seen you're working to inform and inspire, but also empower young people to have a very significant role in their own lives, but also in their communities and in their country. Recently, when I was working in Sri Lanka, as I mentioned, in fact, we used footage on YouTube from some of the debates, competitions you've had here in Nepal, in particular one that had to do with justice and peace, and it really inspired them. I mean, it was a very, very deep discussion. It was quite a strong debate, and it was very relevant, and it was appreciated. So that's just one example of how the work you're doing has an impact not only in Nepal but in the region and in the world.
That was beautiful. Thank you for being with us. It was an honor having you here today.
It's really been my pleasure to be here, and thank you so much for having me.